Hi, I'm Mickey Turner from USC Annenberg, and welcome to a panel conversation featuring the journalists and filmmakers of the documentary Athlete A. The program is co-hosted by Netflix and PEN America, an organization that unites writers and their allies to celebrate creative expression and defend the liberties that make it possible. Joining us tonight are directors John Schenk and Bonnie Cohen, and journalists Steve Berta, Tim Evans, and Marissa Kwiatkowski. Now, for the filmmakers, John and Bonnie, what drew you to this project initially?
These reporters that you see here. We were actually approached about this story by Jennifer Say, who was a 1986 US champion herself. She wrote a book in 2008 called Chalked Up, which was exposing a lot of the psychological and physical abuse inside of USA Gymnastics, not necessarily some of the sexual assault issues, but more about the psychological abuse. And when the Nassar story was going on, she herself thought it would be an interesting time to try and create a film that looked at the Nassar story in the larger context of the institutional problems of USA Gymnastics. And so we met through Julie Bonello, a mutual friend and now producer of Athlete A. And John and I started to dig into the story. And the first thing that came to us was, the reporting, the out of balance reporting that the Indy Star team had done and was continuing to do. And we said, well, it's a deal breaker, if we can get in with these reporters and this incredible work that's been done and is ongoing, we feel like there would be a really amazing film there.
Okay. Now, for the reporters, when you got wind of this initially, was it really hard to wrap your head around all of this? Because there seems like there's so many different levels of complicity here. Where did you start?
Marissa, you want to go?
Sure. So I had been investigating failures to report sexual abuse in schools. There had been a number of cases in Indiana where that had happened, when a source suggested that we look at USA Gymnastics and how they handled such allegations. And that was back in March of 2016. And so I flew to Georgia, picked up almost 1,000 pages of records and came back. And then Tim and Mark Alicia and I dug into them. And that's sort of what brought us to, started us on the path of where we are today.
Yeah, and I would add that you're right. I mean, we did not really know what we were getting into at that point. And we knew that initially we could tell that they had a sort of a secret policy of not reporting child sexual abuse, but we really didn't know if it had resulted in any harm. So our first task was to figure out, had anyone been harmed? And that took us about 3 months just to do that. And once we found 4 coaches that had abused their kids, and that USA Gymnastics had been informed that there were a problem. And once we reported that, that's kind of where the movie begins, really. It opens with a call from somebody who read that initial story, and then it goes kind of from there.
Yeah, the amazing thing is like it's almost like Indy Star was on a boat on the ocean and they saw just a tiny little piece of iceberg. I mean, and they had no idea, and nobody really had any idea what they were going to discover once they started, diving beneath the surface. And they just started. That was really the thing that impressed Bonnie and me, is they, just by kind of doing their work, having the luxury to do their work, the funding and the go ahead of their editors to do this kind of old fashioned reporting that involved thousands of pages of records and freedom of information requests and all that kind of stuff that you learn in journalism school. They were able to uncover one of the biggest scandals ever in sports, and create essentially a moment in time that I think historically will be viewed as one of the important kind of moments for the Me Too movement in the last few years.
Mickey, you're muted. You're muted there.
This is a great film, no doubt. It's a hard film to watch, though. I found myself having so many emotions watching this. But one of the things I remember the most is when Steve said he was a bit conflicted about continuing with the story after talking to Dr. Nasser. Steve, could you talk about that?
That's great.
That was actually Tim, I think.
Or Tim, I'm sorry, Tim.
Yeah, Tim.
I'm sorry. Yes, Tim.
You know, I just start to say, you know, we were almost 6 months into the investigation before Nasser, you know, came up on our radar, and a lot of people remember our series and our work because of Nasser, for obvious reasons. But you know, it was always a story about a bigger issue about systemic problems, and he was just the classic example. You know, I went up and interviewed Nasser very briefly on September 12th of 2016, I believe, and he, you know, really worked me at the end of that interview, almost to the point of tears, you know, pleading that not to do a story that we were going to ruin his life. And, you know, he made a hard case, and, you know, he played on the family and all of that. And, you know, it was a difficult decision, but, you know, at that moment, but when you step back and realized the harm he'd done to so many, and we didn't have a clue at that time how many it was, that, you know, we were just moving forward as journalists. But it's one of those things you have to kind of balance, and you have to kind of check your emotions sometimes.
It's funny, Mickey, it's interesting that you bring that up, because that humanity that comes out in that statement in the film of by Tim, that's a sort of common humanity amongst these reporters, which is what really helped draw us to the story, the way that they approached this subject and the care. I mean, they, you know, they'll tell this better than I, but it's very interesting that they're there in Indianapolis. It's a serious sports town, and here they are coming up against, you know, a major Olympic institution. It's not very easy to do when funding and popularity exist in the town that you live in. So we had so much respect for that work against that backdrop.
There you go. Now, you know, I brought up the levels of complicity before. And when you watch the film, okay, of course, you've got USA Gymnastics. Okay, you've got coaches. You've got, you know, the people who run the clubs. But then you've got parents. And can you talk a little bit about, you know, the parents and their sort of involvement in all this? Because it seems to me, if my child came to me and, you know, said what Maggie said to her parents, that there would be a situation. You know, to put it nicely.
Well, as soon as Maggie did report to her parents, and actually it wasn't something that she necessarily felt comfortable doing. I think when these kinds of things happen and you're in a culture of obedience, as you are at the elite level,
Mm-hmm.
gymnastics and most sports, you don't necessarily want to dissent. You know, it's not a culture where dissent is really taken seriously or allowed. And so even with your parents, right? You know, and the way that this came out was Maggie's coach overheard her talking to another gymnast about what had happened. And it was actually her coach that called Maggie's parents, right?
Right.
So I think had that not happened, it's unclear that Maggie would have felt comfortable coming forward as early as she did. But she thought long and hard about it. It took about 2 or 3 weeks, and then eventually agreed to report to USA Gymnastics. But the second her parents heard about it, I can tell you these parents are incredible people, and they were a dog with a bone. They were after this organization. They were on it, trying to figure out when the FBI was going to get involved, why there wasn't follow-up, and quite possibly actually to their detriment, right, in terms of her place on the Olympic team. So it was a very secretive world. I think I would sort of defend them actually by saying that when they knew, they left. And wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I think that was our, you know, we're parents of, well, now college kids, but, you know, at the time we were making this film, high school kids. And so we really identify with exactly what you're talking about, like where, you know, it is an instinct to say, well, where were the parents? But we've learned, and maybe the reporters can chime in too, that, you know, abuse is very complicated for children. That it's actually very common for children to not even know that they have been abused, and not necessarily even say anything to anyone. You know, and so a number of Nassar's victims actually only realized after the reporting came out by the Indy Star that they were abused, and that was maybe the source of some trauma in their life that they knew was there but couldn't quite place it. So it's very complicated. And you know, the other thing is and oftentimes, you know, I'm sure that there's some bad eggs out there and some bad parents as well, but I think we really came to see it as the parents being victims as well. You know, they got kind of caught up in the same kind of almost like pyramid scheme that USAG was selling to its members, and literally being lied to about, you know, the coaches' background that are often coaching their kids. So we actually came around on that issue and started to sort of feel for the parents as well.
Okay. Now, was there any evidence that the Carolis were involved in any of this, that they had any knowledge of what was going on? Were they too complicit?
Do you guys want to take that?
Yeah, I think.
Well, we did not specifically uncover it, but I think you see some of that in the film, actually, that they did have some awareness of Nassar's activities, and in particular, they certainly had to have known after 2015, because even Scott Blackman, the head of the U.S. Olympic Committee, it came out later, had been informed after Maggie had reported, and after Larry Nassar had been had left USA Gymnastics. So, you know, it's hard to tell, but I believe I believe there was a deposition in the film that even showed Marta Caroli saying that Mr. Penny had informed her.
That's right. That's right.
So
I believe there were some emails during a time they were covering for Nassar's mysterious disappearance from some key events that Marta was included on. And
that reporting, well, Tim and Marissa, they're reporting on those emails. They had this tranche of emails that came to them, and that was part of it, that they knew way more than they let on.
Yeah, that was part of the interesting thing about making this film is we Bonnie and I kind of got wind of the story in 2017. But of course, a lot of the reporting had happened at that point, but it wasn't finished. The reporters were still kind of like a dog with a bone on it for another year or so after we started filming. So we were able to capture a scene where Tim and Marissa were getting a kind of a tranche of emails that some colleagues of theirs had uncovered that included this very piece of information, that there was kind of a small group of individuals in the higher echelons of USAG that pretty much knew every step of the way what was going on once Maggie Nichols reported to her coach that Nassar had abused her. And they really did cover it up for at least a month, probably more like a year, until they were essentially forced to admit what happened. And you get in the film, you see that it goes way beyond that. It looks like the FBI probably also, at the very least, dragged their feet, but probably was also in on some of the cover up. So it's quite in the last year or so, we've all learned this term, kind of systemic, abuse and systemic problems with kind of keeping people subjugated in vast systems. And this really is one of those systems where it was just such a corrupt situation through and through, and almost at every level there was people at the very least looking at the other way, and and sometimes gaining financially by doing so.
Do we know how it got to this point, though? I mean, you look at gymnastics, it appears to be one of the most wholesome sports, particularly in the Olympics. how did we kind of get to this point where everything just kind of spiraled?
Well, I think you can see from the film, Bonnie and John do a great job of sort of showing the history and sort of how that culture in gymnastics evolved. In terms of our reporting and revealing that USA Gymnastics executives had a policy of not reporting all allegations of sexual abuse to authorities, we know that that was a policy that had been in place for decades. It really had not changed in that decades-long period.
And what they had an incentive to do that, because the way that the USA Gymnastics is set up is they have these independent gyms that are members of USA Gymnastics. So the incentive for USA Gymnastics the economic incentive was to deflect any responsibility for what goes on in the individual gyms and claim they had no authority or control over that. So that's precisely what they did. The problem was that the laws in most states make it illegal to not report child sexual abuse immediately. And immediately in the state of Indiana in particular meant there was a Supreme Court case that found that a case where they had not reported for 4 hours was not soon enough. So the fact that they knew was enough. And so they found themselves in an awkward position of being in a position where they said, it's not our problem. It's not our responsibility to report it. And for PR and legal purposes, really.
And like a lot of institutions, I'd say, they had a lot of sponsorship money in writing on that. And they didn't want problems. They didn't want to tarnish a golden image. They were the golden children of the Olympic movement. And, they didn't want anything to kill that golden cow or that, golden goose.
I mean, I would imagine that all of you had a sort of visceral reaction to all this, but was there anything, what was the thing that surprised you the most about this whole story, this whole scandal?
I'll jump in. I think the willingness and the trust that the survivors put in us, a lot of this was done from afar, talking to a complete stranger who would call them up and say, hey, tell me about the worst thing that's happened to you in your life, and that they trusted us with their stories. And then that put a great deal of pressure on us, at least personally on me, to not let these people down who were looking at us as kind of a last resort for justice. And but that they were so willing to share with us, and you could just tell the pain and the hurt that they had, and how the pressure. We were that last chance, and that was, that probably was the biggest shock to me.
What about you, Marissa?
I completely agree with Tim on that. I think the other thing that still sticks in my mind that I still see happening today, even in other sports as well, is how quick some people in a sport are to defend the person who's accused, and how, really toxic of an environment they can create by, putting down a survivor who's trying to share their story and speak out, and, sort of giving that coach or that individual the benefit of the doubt, but not giving that same benefit of the doubt to the survivor. It continually surprises me when I see that across sports.
Yeah. And Steve, anything surprise you?
Yeah, for me, I think it was just the kind of widespread complicity of people like law enforcement, and because we had the head of the what was he, Marissa, the
Child abuse unit.
Yeah, the child abuse unit at Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department tried to discourage us from doing these stories. He was a friend of Steve Penny's, and that kind of thing was fairly widespread. I mean, you saw that that Steve Penny was dangling a job before the FBI agent. You saw, I mean, and everybody was agreed to a level of secrecy around this and untouchableness for the people who were involved that was really awful. And I think that it really says a lot about how, and the movie does this very well, by the way, how openness, an open society needs information to be out there where people can access it. And until it happens, there's no justice, because there's these forces that want to keep things secret. And the level of that is sort of breathtaking in this particular case, I felt. And every time we turned around, it was more and more and more elaborate. And we just, it was shocking.
Right. Now, in the film, you have a number of elite athletes and some Olympians. When you're reaching out to these people, were there people who just would not talk to you or didn't want to be in the film, but were somewhat supportive of the cause?
Our experience was that everyone was supportive,
Mm-hmm.
and wanted the story out there. They may have had individual reasons for not participating. For example, they may have wanted to share their own story in their own film or in their own way. So that came up for sure. There's also a distinction to be made between, retired athletes and athletes that are currently participating and going on to the next Olympics or the next NCAA championship, wherever they are. That was what was so striking about Maggie's bravery, honestly, because she was a working gymnast. She was continuing her career. She was a career NCAA, probably the most decorated NCAA gymnast ever. And she participated in this film in the middle of that. So our experience was, yes, we reached out to a lot of different gymnasts. We actually were very tactical about it. We weren't just going for fame. We were going for the exact people that played a particular role in the telling of this story. So, for example, of course, we had to have Rachel Denhollander, Jamie Dancher, and Jessica Howard, because they were the first three to report to the Indianapolis Star. In order to tell that story well, we had to make sure to get them in the film, and they were anxious to participate. Not anxious, that's the wrong word. It was very brave of them to participate at all, but they felt very strongly that this story needed to be told in film in its entirety, putting all the pieces together. So for the most part, we were thrilled with who agreed to participate.
That was one of the I don't know if it's surprising, but certainly kind of sobering things to Bonnie and me, is that there was a very particular kind of relay race type story in that Athlete A tells, which is that the reporters happened upon this story and Marissa ran down to Georgia, and that started this chain of events that eventually put Nasser in jail and got Steve Penny, the former president of USA Gymnastics, arrested, and then led to the drama that we all know. If somebody said to us, like, is it a good thing that we have a child predator on the loose that is free to abuse hundreds and hundreds of young underage athletes? Of course, 99.99% of people in the world would say, no, that person belongs in jail. But if one thing did not go right in the story, he would probably still be out there. If these reporters didn't get this bone in their teeth, if Rachel Denhollander did not write an email in response to that article and provide them more information about Nasser, if the other gymnasts did not step up, The one amazing thing that we haven't talked about is the cops that got involved in this story, put on a clinic about what a police person should do when somebody accuses somebody of sexual assault. Usually, unfortunately, as we know with the rape backlog kits all around the country, these cases don't really get properly investigated. But in the case of Andrea Mumford at Michigan State, she got wind of this Nassar accusation, and she just went to town on it and did her job as a police detective. And it just goes on and on with all these key people who played such an exemplary role at these crucial moments in this story. And if any one of those were taken out like a Jenga tower, the whole thing would collapse. And so that's one thing that's really surprising, I think, to Bonnie and me, is that how many things have to go right to bring down such a horrible person and such a horrible who's protected by the system.
Right.
I'd just add real quickly that, when we first started out, we did have difficulty, months before Nassar came on the scene, getting people in gymnastics to speak to us because they were all afraid there was such a powerful organization. And, talking about those Jenga blocks, had we not had about 3 or 4 of the people who were in our first story, had they not stepped forward, we may have never had that story. And Rachel Denholder and Jamie and those may have never seen a story. And again, those are kind of the unsung heroes and people that are really special to me. And it's not criticizing anyone else, but they came out when it was absolutely the hardest and had nothing to personally gain from it. And it made it maybe a little easier for the others. The snowball started going downhill and got some momentum. But those first 4 or 5 women and a couple of advocates who, we hit brick wall after brick wall trying to get people to speak up about the problems. And finally, we got that first story. And then, that kind of was the crack in the dam. And finally, it broke through. And, those are people that I'm going to always be thankful for. And I like to always try to remember them, even though none of them were, high profile gymnasts or anything like that. But they were in a position that gave us what we needed.
All of this comes back to the women, actually. I mean, even the depositions that we got copies of to learn what USA Gymnastics policy was, those would not exist if a survivor hadn't come forward in Georgia and filed a lawsuit relating to this. So all of this happened because these survivors shared their stories and were using their voices. And so everything that's come out of that is really a credit to them and their bravery.
Now, do you think we're at a point where we won't see this happen again in any sport, or particularly in gymnastics? Has that culture, from your vantage point, at all changed?
Well, it was wild. When Athlete A came out on Netflix on June 24th of this past year, 2020, we're all in our homes, and during COVID, we don't exactly know what the impact has been, and we sort of waited with bated breath to figure out how the film would drop and hit. And slowly but surely, what started to happen was all these athletes in different countries around the world started to speak out about, they recognized something in the film that was true to their experience. They started speaking out. Gymnasts, but not just gymnasts, figure skaters, all kinds of different athletes, and again across the country spectrum, from the UK down to Australia, raising their voices to their own federations, their Olympic movements, if that was the case, or the club level, whatever, to say, hang on a second, I recognize this psychological and physical abuse from my coach. We've got to do something about that here. And it hit Olympic level, in the UK and Australia, there were Olympic athletes speaking out. And that was truly spectacular for us to witness. So if you start with the Out of Balance series, at the Indy Star, and you take it all the way to the press that was coming out after the film, well into late August, early September, it's hard to believe how much of this has gone on and in how many crevices of the athletic world. So I think we would be hard pressed to say that it's not going to continue. But the way in which these survivors have used their voices and amplified across international borders now, that's going to have an effect.
There is an interesting movement going on in the Olympic side of things, where an organization called Global Athlete is trying to lobby to get the Olympic Charter itself to change itself. I mean, there's no real human rights protection in the Olympic Charter, if you can believe it. This is an organization that is worldwide, through which hundreds of thousands of athletes, kind of come in contact with in their lives. Really depends on kids essentially getting involved in athletics at a young age, and yet they take no responsibility for the humane treatment of these people. And we certainly saw that. I'm sure the reporters could speak to that. There's just no sense of responsibility up the chain of command, other than to make the organization financially successful.
Right. I have one last question that I'd like to ask all of you. After all this, what validates all the work that you put in to your film and into your reporting? What's the validation for you?
I'll jump in, I guess. And, I think just the support and love that the survivors have shown us. And, I had experienced John and the crew, I think, followed me to Washington, D.C. for a Senate hearing. And there were a number of the survivors there. A few of them I knew or talked to. I didn't know most of them. And, they after the hearing, they kind of found out who I was and lined up, and tell me, oh, sorry, I'm getting most of this, obviously how it impacted me, but, I'm their hero and that kind of thing. And I said, I'm just a reporter. You're the heroes, you're the ones who stepped forward and did it. I was just doing my job, and, couldn't ask for more validation than that.
That was an incredible moment. I remember Jessica Howard, who's one of the 3 key Nassar survivors who contacted the Indy Star in the aftermath of their first article about USAG. She really had a rough time of it as a kid growing up in the gymnastics community. And when she saw Tim in person for the first time, she was just kind of in awe of, in her life, Tim is a kind of a rock star hero who literally changed the course of her life and helped her climb out of this trauma that she'd been living with for I don't know, 20 years by the time I think maybe Tim met her, since the abuse occurred. So that was incredibly emotional to witness.
I'm glad you guys didn't use anything from that, because I was probably more emotional then than I am now.
It was really cool. Well, we have it on film. We can send it to you. Amazing moment.
And what about you, Bonnie? What was the validation for you?
I don't know. These films are really, really hard to make. They take a long time. It's very difficult subject matter. It's but sitting with each of these survivors, I don't think it's what I'm going to say is very different from the reporter's experience, but sitting with each of these survivors and letting them tell their story on their own terms, just sort of opening up the forum for them to guide us in how they want to tell their story. I find that incredibly satisfying as a filmmaker, because so often we're trying to kind of structure and box and create narrative. And we do that in this film with the history and a lot of the way in which we follow the reporters. But when it came to the interviews with the survivors, we let them lead that story. And that's never a bad decision.
Absolutely. And Steve?
Well, I have 3 daughters and 2 granddaughters. And when all those survivors were giving their statements during the sentencing hearing, I got texts from them, and I remember I stood up at my desk. I started walking across the room, and I was, kind of choked up, and one of the editors there said, "Hey, are you okay? What's wrong?" I said, "Well, my daughters just texted me, said they were proud of me. And, that was a big moment. It was a huge emotional thing. And I think it's because there's something universal in that. And you feel like if you've helped somebody, there's no better. I mean, sometimes what we do as investigative journalists is we kind of show people who are doing rotten things, but in some cases, there's not a clear person who is benefiting. In this case, there really was, and their children. Tim and I were working on another story this year about old people in nursing homes, and they've been during this COVID thing have been dying at just a high rate, and those we've had the same kind of responses from people saying, that they really appreciate our work, and that means a lot.
And Marissa?
For me, there's two things. The first is, I'm really happy that change is happening as a result of all of the work we've done. There's still a lot that has to be done, but there is a new federal law that requires all national governing bodies to immediately report allegations of abuse. There have been numerous policy changes and things that hopefully will make kids safer in the sport. So that is something I think that makes me feel good about all the work that we've done. And then I think the other thing is, just the incredible power of one voice and how one voice leads to another voice, and how the women that we've interacted with, the incredible survivors that we've interviewed, sharing their voices has given so many other people the comfort and the strength to share their own. And you've seen that, after Athlete A came out with, as Bonnie was talking about, all of the other places that are having their own sort of reckonings with no longer being comfortable with the status quo and demanding more of these organizations.
Absolutely. That's great. Well, thank you all for your responses and for doing this film, first of all, and also where it starts at the Indy Star. Thank all of you for your diligent and hard work. This is a story that needed to be exposed, and your work definitely has helped us all. So we're going to take some questions from the audience now, and my dog. First question, could you speak to any legal challenges you have encountered while making and releasing the film?
Any legal challenges?
Gosh.
Don't jinx them.
I mean, it depends what you mean by that. Legal challenges having to do with the subject matter, or legal challenges having to do with the filmmaking?
It looks, it just says that you've encountered while making and releasing the film. So
no,
I guess they're asking if you've gotten any letters from
we have a very buttoned up. We're very buttoned up. We have wonderful producers and lawyers, and we fact check everything. I mean, Steve fact checks 4 times. We fact check 6 times. We just make sure that everything in the film, including all the archival materials, et cetera, have legal recourse and reason for being in the film.
The one thing that comes to mind is, we did have kind of a internal debate about those videos that you see a little bit of in the film of Nasser treating young gymnasts. He had a website at a certain point where he was kind of purporting to teach other osteopathic physicians how to do massage therapy and stuff on patients. And so there was a lot of video evidence really of what he would do. And we have a scene in the film where Tim talks about that. We through some attorneys that were working on this case, got our hands on some stuff that Nasser never published, but that was really kind of, quite vivid in terms of it really suggesting that abuse took place. And of course, anytime, that you're about to broadcast or publish video imagery that could come any close to the definition of child pornography or child exploitative material or that kind of thing, a lot of red flags go up. It certainly went up for us. We vetted it by lawyers in our country and in Europe, where we know there's really stringent laws on that. And ultimately, we really kind of had to decide for ourselves what were we comfortable with, how little of that can we get away with. And we went to the survivors again, as Bonnie was talking about, and we said, look, what do you all want to see out there in the world? And they kind of gave us their opinion that they did want to show some of that. They wanted to show what the world saw of Nasser and then chose not to act on when they were in the gym. And so
just to add to what John's saying, those videos of Nasser sort of showing his sort of how-to videos, those videos were sent to USA Gymnastics. There were adults at USA Gymnastics who had seen the same material that John's talking about.
Yeah, so that's an example of a little bit of the kind of, it's really ethical and moral as much as it is legal. But of course, the last thing we want to do is get ourselves or Netflix in trouble. So there was a legal aspect to that footage.
Right. Okay.
This is not the film, but we had several legal challenges in reporting this story as well. We fought for these documents to be released all the way to the Georgia Supreme Court. And actually, we ended up having to go there twice. And before we could get those released, USA Gymnastics did, in fact, send us a little bit of hate mail, and we responded accordingly. And they were, and we fought pretty hard to get the information we did.
Yeah.
Okay. Before I move on to question number 2, I just encourage the audience to put your questions in chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Has covering the story impacted your work at large? This is for the filmmakers and the journalists.
I'll jump in. Marissa and I both came to the story with a background in writing about child abuse and child welfare and child protection. Mm-hmm. And while I've gone on to do some other things, Marissa is now, she's still writing these same stories about, you asked a question earlier about other sports. She can tell you about it, but she's been writing about cheerleading and very similar kind of things happening in that area. But it was kind of a continuation of the work we've done. And a lot of what we do, and I think Steve alluded to this, we do a lot of the same kind of thing. It's just a different topic and different people involved. My last project was senior citizens in nursing homes who were being abused and not getting the care they deserved. So sometimes it's like Groundhog Day, but with a little bit of a twist. So,
I'm always in the background, and the reporters are out front. I'm an editor, and but after the film came out, I started getting a lot of mail from people who wanted us to investigate various things.
Wow. Okay. And what about you, John and Bonnie?
Well, we had, prior to Athlete A, made a film called Audrey and Daisy, which told the story of 2 high school age girls who were sexually assaulted and then bullied online, and just kind of went through this incredible twofold trauma, both with the assault and the kind of subsequent treatment of them and their families and their communities. So Athlete A in some ways was a I don't know if it's the wrong word, continuation of some work that we had been done regarding trauma and abuse, and kind of sort of investigating what happens when that happens to somebody, what happens to their life, what happens, what the reaction is to the community, what systems are in place to allow that to happen. it's hard stuff. It's difficult stuff. It actually, it takes a toll, as I'm sure the journalists would agree. You know, when you're going into the office every day and kind of, you know, talking to, your job is to talk to people and investigate the circumstances around their people's abuse. It's tough. It kind of, in a way, reminds you of the worst of humanity on an hour by hour basis. So as Bonnie would say, these are hard films to make. We certainly are interested in this topic, and we're kind of blown away by the times that we're living with in terms of what's happening with this greater, you know, history of Me Too movement at this time. So we're certainly open to, you know, other stories along the lines of this, but we're just really kind of in awe of the people that we covered. Again, the reporters, the survivors, the folks that really were kind of played a vital role in bringing this particular story to light.
Okay. Now this is a question. Did you speak to Mr. Nasser, his family, Dr. Nasser, rather, his family, or correspond with his lawyer during the process of making the film?
So we make it a habit of, you know, if there is going to be someone spoken about in our films, we will reach out to legal counsel. In the case of Dr. Nasser, he was already in prison. But we didn't expect to get much back in return. We do want to give the opportunity to whomever, you know, whoever is going to be in the film to have their own voice, their own take. But from a film perspective, from a story perspective, we felt that there were, you know, we were going to get to Nasser through the main characters in the film. So, for example, you access him through Tim and his interview with him that you hear. You have audio access to Nasser and his lawyer. You meet him through Andrea Mumford when she's interrogating him in that surveillance footage in Michigan, and then of course you see him in the courtroom with the survivors. Well, first you see him, you know, on the gym floors when he was acting as a doctor, and then you see him in the courtroom with the survivors. So we sort of made a decision that Nasser would be accessed through the characters, the main characters of the movie, and in their perspective, in their experience. So I'm not sure if I answered the question, but we do reach out, of course, not expecting to get much in return. And actually, in the end, we felt it worked out fine for the film.
Okay. Now, this is a question I think all of you can answer as well. Secondary trauma is a real thing. Okay. And I was wondering this as well as when I was watching the film. How did all of you take care of yourselves and while covering these issues? Because they're very disturbing, you know, so.
It's a great question.
Well, I sought counseling and it helped me a lot. It was mainly because I had other things going on in my life, you know, and it was just very stressful. And it's not just the secondary trauma in this case. I mean, you've got people threatening to sue you. I had family issues. My father-in-law died while we were reporting the Nasser story, and I was trying to help with his care. And I mean, there was a bunch of stuff that happened right around that time, and yeah, it was. That was what I did. And it was the talking cure that worked for me.
Right.
You know, John and I work, and we did work with this organization on Audrey and Daisy as well. They're called Futures Without Violence, and they're dedicated to issues of, domestic abuse and sexual assault, et cetera, and try to educate around these issues. And they did a lot of the outreach, and they helped with the educational curriculum, et cetera. But more than that, they're friends and colleagues and incredibly well-versed in trauma And we had the great fortune of being able to really rely on them, both in the making of Audrey and Daisy and with Athlete A, in helping to guide us through as makers and as parents, as a woman. How do you kind of, get through these really, really difficult moments and stay respectful of the people in the film while also taking care of yourself. And I think we both feel really fortunate to have had that relationship.
Right. Right. And Tim and Marissa, this is a hard beat that you cover. How did this affect you personally after all your reporting?
Tough question. Tim and I both, as he mentioned earlier, have written a lot about these kind of topics for years. And so, I think we all sort of, especially in journalism, you have to develop a mechanism to take yourself out of the topics that you're covering because they are really difficult topics. And so everyone has their own thing. My thing was, we were working morning, days, nights, weekends, constantly. And so my outlets were really exercise and then romance novels because I was guaranteed a happily ever after. And it was nice to have that, in the context of everything that we were working on. So, everyone's thing is going to be different, but, especially when you're writing a lot about trauma or working on things a lot relating to trauma, you have to have some kind of an outlet, to take yourself out of that situation.
I'd say, I got a very supportive wife and family, and, they're very good about it. And the other thing I'd say is I'm a wannabe musician, and when the voices in my head got too loud, I'd go in the music room and turn up my electric guitar really loud and drown them out. So.
Now, are there stories, subjects that any of you would like to cover in the future as filmmakers and as reporters, and particularly, when local news is so important, very important these days, finding those stories locally and sharing those with the rest of the world?
Don't ask us to give away our secrets.
Oh, okay. I tried.
I will say that another kind of thrill for Bonnie and me with this film is to highlight local journalism. This is a case of reporters in a medium-sized American city that has its own, it has its own kind of power structure that, as Bonnie was talking about before, there's a lot of sports culture in Indianapolis. A lot of people with a lot to lose with sports franchises and that kind of thing. And we're living at a time when the finances of journalism are changing drastically. I mean, we literally watch the newsroom at the Indy Star kind of morph and change as Gannett merged with a company, and then the whole thing got sold to another company. Things are changing fast in the world of investigative journalism, and of course we have the background of the politics in which where we witnessed some of our leaders attack journalism and journalists themselves. And so we were just incredibly proud to highlight the work of these great folks. I mean, it's so important. We wouldn't have the justice that was served in this case at USA Gymnastics without local journalists. This is not something that the New York Times and the Washington Post might not have ever heard about because they weren't in Indianapolis, with the contacts that Marissa, Tim, and Steve had. And so we're happy to celebrate that in this film.
And go ahead. I'm sorry.
One of the things I came away from the film with was that, I felt like it was almost a love letter to local journalism in a way. That was one of the themes. And, again, it's a tough time to be a journalist. It's a tough time in an industry. It's, we're attacked by all fronts, economically, politically. And, I couldn't have been more pleased. And it was a weird situation because suddenly we were on the other side of the camera, so to speak. We were the people being interviewed, and it's like, it was an eye-opening experience in some ways because, now I know how the people that I interview feel. Like, are they going to do me justice? Are they going to take something out of context? And these guys just did a, fantastic job. I couldn't have been happier with the way it came out. I think we all feel that way. And, it was a learning experience for me on, okay, maybe I'll think twice about how I deal with somebody from my experience with Addie. But, it came out great as far as we were concerned.
Thank you, Tim. That's very,
Tim.
very nice to hear.
With the budget situation at newspapers across the country, what are your hopes for investigative journalism? Because it does take a large chunk of the budget sometimes to bring these stories to fruition. What are your hopes?
Feels a little self-serving to say I hope they invest in it. But some of the most incredible investigations are happening at the local level. There's a great newsletter through investigative reporters and editors called Local Matters, and every single week they send out some great investigations that are happening across the country in local newsrooms that may not have huge resources. And there's also a lot of incredible work being done at the national level. So, I think that, not to be that person plugging things, but, supporting local publications helps them be able to do this kind of work. I mean, we were incredibly, incredibly fortunate that we had bosses who supported the work that we were doing and put the resources behind it to pay for me to fly all over, to pay for all the records that we were doing, to pay for, as Steve talked about, the challenges in the legal system to get access to records. I mean, all of those things were because they believed in the work we were doing and the importance of it.
Yeah, and I would say that there's sort of as these newspapers get smaller, you have to make some choices, and the choices that are being made are disproportionately toward investigative journalism, more so than before. I mean, our team was a fairly large team for a paper of that size, and it was when I first got to the Indianapolis Star was 2005. And there was, I think it was 265 journalists in that newsroom. I don't know that there's, I don't know if there's 100 there now, but it's way smaller. But the investigative team is larger, so that tells you something right there. There are value judgments being made and because we know that is the critical thing that we bring, and they're more and more aware of that as things narrow. And so I hate to say that I'm totally optimistic about it, but there is reason for optimism where investigative journalism is concerned. Politicians want to make it sound as if everything we do is political, but some things aren't political. Most of what journalists do is not political. These were not political stories, and I think that if we can bolster that more and push investigations that are fact-based and well vetted, it'll be good for America.
I think that's a great point, Steve. And, it reminds me that, in a funny way, documentary film is experiencing kind of a renaissance these days because partly because I think there's some of our national news organizations have been whittled down, and people are still looking for real stories, and documentary maybe has filled that gap a little bit. But I think another thing that's happened in the documentary film world is, with these new companies like Netflix and Hulu and Apple getting into the business and kind of disrupting the business of film distribution, is that it's been proven now that there's real value in authentic stories. It turns out that people really want to hear real stories about real people. And Tim, Marissa, and Steve, that's their business. They go out every day, literally, and they talk to real people, and they're getting kind of the raw material for what is hopefully sometimes turned into larger stories. They themselves are sometimes accompanied by photographers or videographers who are getting evidence of the work that they're doing on the ground. And Bonnie and I have witnessed in our career that there's been kind of this a little bit of a mill cycle where stories start at a local level, and filmmakers like us depend upon people like this to kind of find those stories, and then we're going into these newsrooms now, and we're finding not only are the stories there, but in the case of the Indy Star, they had documented their reporting. So they had video footage of Rachel Denhollander the first time they spoke to her, and that was just crucial material that we use in the making of Athlete A. So I think that Steve brings up a good point, which is that at the same time that there's maybe financial challenges for the newspaper industry, there's a recognition that there's a kind of a hunger and a value to telling real stories, and there always will be.
I agree totally. Bonnie, John, Steve, Tim, Marissa, thank you so much on behalf of Penn and myself. And Marissa, you have one last chance to tell me what you're working on.
Oh man, I respectfully pass, but I'm at USA Today, so you can read USA Today and find out.
Okay, you're pleading the fifth like Steve Penny. All right.
And Nikki, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Nikki. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Penn.
Okay.